They say New York never sleeps, but that night the streets felt like they were holding their breath. And somewhere in that silence, I was making my first move. The rain had been falling all day, the kind of steady drizzle that seeps into your bones and makes the whole city feel like it's been draped in a wet wool coat. By the time night rolled in, the streets glistened under the gas lamps and flickering neon signs, each puddle reflecting the shaky light like a cheap mirror. The Lower East Side had its own music, muted footsteps on slick cobblestones, the distant hiss of streetcars, the occasional shout from a bar on the corner, but tonight, even that melody seemed quieter. They call New York the city that never sleeps. But I'm telling you, there are nights when it listens. When it waits. When every window, every dark alley, every shadow seems to lean in, curious about what's gonna happen next. This was one of those nights. And me? I was 25, wearing my best suit, and about to decide which way my life was gonna go. The air was thick with the smell of wet pavement, roasted chestnuts from a vendor down on Hester Street, and the faint tang of cigar smoke drifting from a doorway where a couple of older guys kept their eyes low but their ears open. I knew them, everybody knew them, but we didn't exchange a word. In this neighborhood, sometimes silence was the only safe greeting. I walked past a speakeasy, the kind with no sign, just a red light above the door and a doorman who looked at you like he could read your whole life story in 2 seconds. He gave me the once-over, nodded slightly. I didn't go in. Not yet. Tonight wasn't about drinking, it was about watching, listening, and making sure I was in the right place when the right moment came along. See, by then I'd learned something important in this city: opportunity didn't always knock. Sometimes it whispered. And if you weren't close enough to hear it, you'd miss it forever. I kept my hands in my coat pockets, fingers brushing the smooth handle of the switchblade I carried, not because I wanted trouble, but because I understood trouble had a way of wanting me. Up ahead, the glow from Katz's Deli spilled across the sidewalk, catching the rain in golden streaks. A couple of men stood outside, smoking and laughing too loud, trying to prove they weren't afraid of anything. I knew better. In these streets, the men who laughed loudest were often the ones who were most scared. A streetcar clanged past, spraying muddy water onto the curb. I stepped back, my shoes already damp from the evening's walk, and took a moment to look around. The buildings here were tall and narrow, like they were leaning in on each other for warmth. Fire escapes zigzagged down their faces like iron scars. Behind some of those windows, families were gathered around small kitchen tables, their conversations in a half-dozen languages. Down here, life was crowded, noisy, and raw, but it was also full of ambition. I knew what it was to have nothing. I'd felt the weight of it in Sicily, and I'd felt it again when my family came here. Poverty wasn't just empty pockets, it was a kind of pressure, a constant reminder that the world didn't owe you a thing. You either carved out your piece, or you were left standing in the cold. And I was done being cold. At the corner, I stopped to light a cigarette. The match flared, catching the raindrops in its glow for a heartbeat before the wind snuffed it out. I tried again, shielding the flame with my hand. The first drag was warm, settling in my chest like a promise. Somewhere behind me, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate. I didn't turn right away. In my world, turning too fast could make a man think you were nervous. Nervous men got hurt. When I finally glanced over my shoulder, I saw him. Tony, a guy I'd done a couple of runs with. Broad shoulders, quick smile that never reached his eyes. He stepped up beside me, nodded at my cigarette. "Gimme one," he said, not asking so much as assuming. I handed him one, lit it for him. For a moment, we stood there in the drizzle, watching the street. "You hear about Masuria?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer. Not yet. I just watched the smoke curl from his lips, the way his eyes darted toward the darkened alley across the street. "They say he's got a job for the right guy," Tony continued. "The kind of job that could make a man's year." That was the whisper I'd been waiting for. I didn't show it, but inside, my pulse ticked up a notch. Masuria was no small-time player. Working for him could mean money, connections, and danger enough to sink a dozen men. Maybe, I said, my voice even. But I hear he's got enemies, too. Tony chuckled, low and knowing. Everybody worth knowing does. The rain picked up, pattering against the brim of my hat. We stood there another minute before Tony flicked his cigarette into the gutter and walked off, disappearing into the glow of a corner street lamp. I stayed a while longer, letting the moment settle, memorizing the way the street felt. That night, New York seemed to be holding its breath, because something was shifting. Lines were being drawn, alliances tested, futures decided in backrooms and alleys. And I knew somehow I was gonna be part of it. I started walking again, the city stretching ahead of me like a chessboard. Every block, every face, every shadow was a piece in a game I was only just beginning to understand. Somewhere in that wet, humming silence, I could almost hear the sound of cards being shuffled, dice rolling, coins changing hands. The night was young, and so was I. But the thing about youth is, it doesn't last. You think you've got time, but in my world, time was just another thing that could get stolen. As I reached the corner of Rivington Street, I glanced up at the tenement windows. Behind some of them, the lights were still on, families arguing, lovers whispering, deals being struck. Behind others, darkness pressed against the glass, hiding whatever secrets lay inside. I didn't know it yet, but I was standing at the edge of something bigger than I'd ever imagined. Bigger than the Lower East Side. Bigger than New York. The kind of story people would tell long after I was gone. But for now, all I knew was the sound of my own footsteps, the taste of tobacco, and the way the rain felt on my face. The streets had gone quiet, but they weren't asleep. No, they were watching. Waiting. And so was I. Because in this city, the night only holds its breath for so long before someone decides to make it exhale. You don't choose where you start in life, but if you're smart, you make damn sure you choose where you finish. The thing about beginnings is you never know they're beginnings until you're already halfway down the road. I was born far from the electric hum of New York, Lercora Fritti, Sicily. A town so small you could walk across it before your coffee got cold. Cobblestone streets, dry hills that rolled toward the horizon, and air that smelled like dust and bread. My father worked the sulfur mines, shoulders bent under years of labor, his hands stained with work that never paid enough to change our lives. Sicily was beautiful, sure. But beauty don't put food on the table. My mother knew it, my father knew it, and eventually so did I. We were poor like most families there, but in our house, poverty wasn't something you complained about, it was something you outlasted. I was 9 when my father said we were leaving America. The word felt like a magic spell when I first heard it. A place where streets were paved with gold, at least that's what the old-timers said. In reality, the streets weren't gold. They were cold, crowded, and if you weren't careful, they could swallow you whole. We landed in New York in 1906. I remember the first time I saw the skyline, those towering buildings reaching into the clouds like the city was trying to grab hold of the sky itself. It was noisy, it was alive, and it was nothing like Sicily. The air smelled of coal smoke, horses, and the salty breath of the harbor. For a kid fresh off the boat, it was overwhelming. We settled in the Lower East Side, crammed into a tenement that felt like it could collapse if too many people leaned on one wall at the same time. One room, 6 of us, and walls so thin you could hear the neighbors' arguments like they were happening at your own table. The streets outside were a mix of languages, Italian, Yiddish, English, and a dozen others, shouting over each other in a kind of constant competition for who could be heard first. It didn't take long to realize something important: in America, they didn't care much for Sicilians. To them, we were just another group of immigrants who worked cheap and talked funny. The Irish kids, the Jewish kids, they had their own neighborhoods, their own rules, and they let you know real quick if you didn't belong. School was no different. I learned English fast, but I also learned that words didn't always get you out of trouble. I started running errands for the older boys in the neighborhood. Little things at first, delivering packages, carrying messages. You didn't ask what was in the package, and you didn't repeat what was in the message. That was the rule. It was work, and work meant money. A nickel here, a dime there. Enough to buy bread, maybe some candy if I felt generous with myself. My father hated it. He wanted me to stay in school, get an honest job. He didn't understand that honesty didn't always pay the rent, not in our part of town. My mother? She said less, but she looked at me like she knew I wasn't just carrying packages. Mothers always know. By the time I was 12, I'd found my first real hustle. On the docks, I'd watched the porters unload goods, crates of fruit, bolts of fabric, barrels of wine. Sometimes a crate would go missing. Not stolen exactly. More like misplaced. I'd find a buyer before the day was over. In a city this big, there was always someone willing to pay for what they couldn't or wouldn't buy outright. It was around this time I started noticing the men who didn't seem to answer to anyone. They dressed sharp, tailored suits, polished shoes, hats you couldn't buy from a street vendor. They spoke softly, but when they walked into a room, the air seemed to change. I didn't know all their names, but I knew enough to understand they ran things. And they weren't running them from the back of any factory. One of them, Salvatore Toto Gallo, used to stand outside a cafe on Mulberry Street. He'd drink espresso like it was a religious ritual, slow and deliberate. I started sweeping the sidewalk out front just to be near enough to hear him talk. He noticed me after a while, tossed me a quarter one day for carrying his coat inside. It was the most money I'd made in a week. That's when I understood proximity had value. Still, I wasn't in the game yet. Not really. I was just learning the streets, learning the people, learning when to speak and when to keep my mouth shut. And most importantly, learning that in New York, your past didn't matter as much as your next move. Life at home was still hard. My father's work in construction paid little, and his back ached from years of lifting more than any man should. He came home tired, hands blistered, eyes heavy. I saw the same look in a lot of men around our block, a quiet kind of defeat. I swore I wouldn't end up like that. The streets weren't easy, but they offered something school never could: opportunity. Dangerous, unpredictable, but opportunity all the same. And for a kid with nothing to lose, that was enough. I still remember one cold evening when the snow turned to slush on the sidewalks. I was leaning against the wall outside a billiard hall, trying to keep my shoes dry, when a boy about my age walked up. Skinny, sharp eyes, dressed in hand-me-downs but carrying himself like he owned the block. Meyer Lansky. We didn't know it then, but that meeting would change the course of our lives. We started talking about school, about the gangs, about the little hustles we'd been running. He was smart, quick to see angles other kids missed. And unlike most, he didn't care that I was Sicilian. We shook hands before we parted that night, and in that handshake, something unspoken passed between us. The city was big, unforgiving, and full of men who'd chew you up if you let them. But now, I wasn't just another kid from the Lower East Side. I had a friend who saw the world the way I did. And in a place like New York, that was worth more than gold. Looking back, those days were the foundation. Sicily had given me grit, but New York gave me purpose. I didn't know yet what I'd build with it. But I knew one thing: I'd never be satisfied just surviving. I was gonna thrive. And sometimes, to thrive in this city, you had to be willing to get your hands dirty. School teaches you to read and write. The streets? They teach you how to breathe. The Lower East Side didn't have a curriculum, but it had lessons. And if you didn't learn them fast, you didn't last. The rules weren't written anywhere, you picked them up from the way men talked, the way they stood, the way they didn't look at certain people in the street. By the time I was 13, I'd learned the value of a lookout. Not from a book, but from standing in the cold outside a pool hall while Meyer Lansky and a couple of older boys negotiated with some unlucky gambler. My job was simple: if I saw a cop's hat in the distance, I was to cough twice. No heroics, no questions. Just cough and keep walking. That night, I coughed once too early. Meyer came out a minute later, eyes burning. You cost us $20, Charlie, he said flatly. I told him $20 was better than a night in the tombs. He didn't smile, but he didn't argue either. That was the thing about Meyer, he wasn't the kind to waste words, but when he did speak, it was worth listening to. The streets had their own kind of classroom, and some of the best teachers weren't much older than the students. That's how I met Benjamin Siegel Bugsy to everyone except Meyer. Bugsy was wild. Where Meyer was careful and deliberate, Bugsy was a firecracker with a short fuse. He could talk a cop into letting him off for stealing his own hat, and if talking didn't work, he'd throw the first punch. The three of us made an odd crew: Meyer the brain, Bugsy the muscle, me somewhere in between. We weren't running the city yet, but we were running our corners. Penny ante card games in the back of candy stores, dice in the alleys, protection for vendors who didn't want trouble. We made enough to keep our pockets full and our shoes clean, which, in our world, was a sign of respect. Still, there were bigger players watching. The older guys, the ones with silk ties and brass knuckle smiles, they didn't mind us kids hustling as long as we didn't step on their toes. The trick was to grow without being noticed, to build a game so solid that by the time anyone realized how much you were making, it was too late for them to stop you. One of my earliest lessons came during a poker game in the back room of a bakery. The air was thick with cigar smoke, the kind that sticks to your clothes for days. A man named Petey Two-Toes sat across from me, his missing digits a gift from some past disagreement with a streetcar. We played for small stakes, nickels, dimes, until Petey decided to make it interesting. He pushed a crumpled stack of bills into the pot and grinned like a man who knew something I didn't. I looked at my cards, 2 kings, and felt a rush of certainty. But something in Meyer's eyes, just over Petey's shoulder, made me pause. Meyer gave the slightest shake of his head. I folded. Petey raked in the pot and laughed, but later that night, Meyer told me why. Petey was sitting on 4 aces, he said. I saw him palm one from the bottom of the deck. That was the kind of education you didn't forget. Winning wasn't about playing every strong hand, it was about knowing when to walk away. Bugsy, of course, had his own way of learning. If someone cheated him, he didn't fold. He didn't wait. He made it very clear that you didn't cross him twice. We all had our roles, and somehow, it worked. The neighborhood was changing, too. Prohibition had turned every block into an opportunity. Speakeasies popped up like weeds after rain, and the men who ran them needed liquor. Liquor needed transport. Transport needed protection. And protection needed someone willing to handle problems. We started running small shipments, nothing big, just enough to get our feet wet. Cases of Canadian whiskey hidden in crates labeled olive oil, or bottles smuggled in from the docks under piles of fish. It was dirty work, and the smell of those fish shipments stayed with me longer than I'd like to admit, but it paid better than any honest job we could have landed. One night, we were moving a shipment through a side street when 2 older boys decided they liked the look of our crates. They stepped out from an alley, knives in hand, telling us to leave the booze and walk away. Bugsy didn't walk. He lunged, fist connecting with a crack that echoed off the brick walls. Meyer and I followed suit, not because we liked fighting, but because the streets had taught us something important: you can't afford to look weak. We left those boys bleeding but breathing, the crates still ours. That night, over coffee, Meyer said, we just made a name for ourselves. In our world, that was both good and bad. Good because respect kept certain vultures away. Bad because it drew the attention of people much more dangerous than street-level thieves. By 16, I dropped out of school completely. My father called me a fool. My mother said nothing, though I caught her looking at me like she didn't recognize me sometimes. I told myself I was building a life for all of us, but the truth was, I was building it for me. Our little crew started doing jobs for bigger outfits. We'd run collections, deliver packages, stand watch. Sometimes the packages were heavy with cash, sometimes they were heavier with something else. I stopped asking questions. And here's the thing about the street: it doesn't just teach you how to make money. It teaches you how to see people. You learn the twitch in a man's eye when he's lying, the way someone's voice tightens when they're scared, the way they lean in too close when they're trying to sell you something. I could read people better than any book by then. Meyer taught me patience. Bugsy taught me to strike first when patience ran out. And the streets taught me something neither of them could: how to blend in when I needed to disappear, and how to stand out when I wanted to be noticed. Looking back, those years were the furnace. They burned away whatever softness I'd brought over from Sicily and left something harder, sharper. I wasn't a boss yet. I wasn't even close. But I was learning the game, and I was learning fast. The real players, the ones with citywide pull, were still out there, moving pieces I couldn't see yet. But I knew one thing: the day was coming when we'd be sitting at the same table. And when that day came, I wouldn't just be there to play, I'd be there to win. Every man's got a job that changes him forever. Mine? It came wrapped in a silk suit and a dangerous smile. Prohibition wasn't just a law, it was a gift. A gift to anyone smart enough to see that when the government tells a man he can't drink, the only people who make money are the ones willing to hand him a glass anyway. By 1920, the city was buzzing with underground life. Behind barbershops, under restaurants, in the basements of tailor shops, you'd find card tables, jazz music, and whiskey flowing like it was the 4th of July. All illegal. All profitable. Up until then, Meyer, Bugsy, and I had been running small-time deliveries, crates of Canadian rice smuggled in through the harbor, bottles tucked under layers of sawdust, or kegs rolled off trucks under the cover of darkness. We were earning, sure, but we were still just errand boys. And I wasn't built to be anyone's errand boy. That's when I met Arnold Rothstein. They called him the Brain for a reason. He dressed like a banker, talked like a professor, and thought like a man playing chess while the rest of us were still figuring out checkers. He didn't just run games, he ran people. Politicians, cops, bookmakers, they all owed him something. I met him in the back of a high-end speakeasy uptown. The room smelled of perfume, cigar smoke, and expensive gin. A man in a white tuxedo showed me to a table where Rothstein sat, sipping something clear from a crystal glass. He looked me over once, like he was weighing me against an invisible scale. "I hear you're ambitious," he said. "I hear ambition's what gets you in the room," I replied. A small smile flickered across his face. That was the beginning. Rothstein didn't waste time. He told me about a shipment coming in from Canada, high-quality scotch worth more than gold in the city's speakeasies. The job was simple on paper: pick up the shipment at the docks, move it to a warehouse in Brooklyn, and make sure it stayed there until he was ready to sell. Simple jobs never are. The night of the pickup, fog rolled in off the harbor so thick you could barely see the ships until they were on top of you. Our truck idled near the pier, Meyer in the passenger seat, Bugsy in the back with 2 other guys Rothstein had sent. I kept my collar up, my hat low. The dockhands moved like shadows, rolling barrels toward us without a word. We loaded fast, each barrel thudding into the truck like a drumbeat. Everything was going smooth until it wasn't. A car pulled up, headlights cutting through the fog. 2 men stepped out, long coats hiding what I knew were guns. They weren't cops. Cops yelled first. These guys just walked toward us like they already owned what we were carrying. "Truck stays," one of them said flatly. Bugsy stepped down from the truck, slow, casual, like he was just stretching his legs. "Yeah," he said. "And what's in it for us?" The man's answer was to pull his coat back just enough to show the butt of a pistol. I could feel Meyer tense beside me. Me? I was thinking about Rothstein's smile and what it would look like if I told him I'd lost his shipment. I took a step forward, hands in my pockets, and smiled. "You fellas got a lot of nerve showing up here uninvited. This is Rothstein's shipment." The name hung in the air like a warning. They hesitated just long enough for Bugsy to make his move. His fist connected with the nearest man's jaw before the guy even knew what hit him. The second man reached for his gun, but Meyer was quicker. He drew his own and leveled it without a word. It ended fast. One man on the ground, groaning, the other backing away, hands raised. We finished loading and drove off before they could change their minds. At the warehouse, we rolled the barrels into a backroom that smelled of dust and damp wood. Rothstein was there waiting. He didn't ask about the scuffle, I'm pretty sure he already knew. He just nodded once and said, "You handled yourself well." That was it. No speeches, no promises. Just a nod. But in our world, that nod meant doors were opening. The payout came a week later, more money than I'd ever seen in one place. Enough to buy my mother a new coat, enough to keep my father's rent paid for months, and enough to make me realize something dangerous. Once you taste that kind of money, it's hard to go back. From then on, we weren't just running errands. We were handling serious business, Rothstein's business. Speakeasies in Manhattan, nightclubs in Brooklyn, even a couple of joints in Jersey. We moved liquor, protected shipments, collected debts. And every job built our reputation. With reputation came connections. With connections came bigger risks. I started dressing sharper, custom suits, polished shoes, a fedora with a brim just wide enough to shadow my eyes. Image mattered. People didn't just respect what you did, they respected how you looked doing it. But the streets were watching. Other crews noticed us, some with curiosity, some with resentment. The Irish gangs, the old Italian outfits, even some of the Jewish boys uptown, they all wanted to know who we were and why we were making so much noise. That's when I learned my next big lesson: success paints a target on your back. And if you're not ready to defend it, someone else will wear it. One night, walking home from a meeting, I felt footsteps behind me. Too light for a drunk, too steady for a civilian. I cut down an alley, hand in my coat. The shadow followed. I stopped, turned, and saw a kid, couldn't have been more than 18, holding a knife like it was his first time using one. "They're paying me to send a message," he said, voice shaking. "Then deliver this instead," I told him, and tossed him a folded bill. "Tell whoever sent you I'm not that easy to reach." He took the money and ran. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was scared, because I knew the game was changing. The first big score had made me someone worth targeting. And if I wanted to keep climbing, I'd have to start thinking 3 steps ahead of every man in this city. That's the thing about a first big score, it's never just a payday. It's a declaration. And now, my name was out there. Blood on the sidewalks, whispers in every bar, and me stuck in the middle of a war I didn't start, but sure as hell intended to finish. By the early 1930s, the streets were changing. Prohibition was still pumping liquor and money into every backroom in New York, but the men controlling it weren't content to share. 2 bosses, Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, had turned the city into a chessboard, and every soldier, every crew, every street corner was just another piece in their game. To outsiders, they looked the same, both Sicilian, both powerful, both ruthless. But to us on the inside, the difference was sharp. Masuria was old school, running things the way it had been done back in Sicily, tight circles, loyalty above everything, and not much interest in modernizing. Maranzano, on the other hand, was fresh from Castellamare del Golfo, bringing with him a kind of feudal mentality. He saw himself as a Roman general, with underbosses as captains, soldiers as legionnaires. The problem? There was only room for one king in this city. It started small, an ambush here, a missing shipment there. But soon, the streets were running red. Drive-bys in the middle of the day. Men disappearing without a trace. Families avoiding certain neighborhoods after dark. In cafes, men lowered their voices when certain names came up, and even then, they glanced over their shoulders before finishing the sentence. Me? I was playing both sides. Not out of disloyalty, out of survival. Masuria trusted me enough to keep me close. Maranzano saw my ambition and figured I might be useful. I made sure neither of them knew exactly how much I was talking to the other. The trick in a war like that isn't to win every battle, it's to make sure you're the one left standing when the smoke clears. Meyer didn't like it. "You're dancing on a wire, Charlie," he told me one night over coffee at Lindy's. "One wrong step and you're a dead man." "Maybe," I said. "But when this war ends, someone's gonna run the whole show. And I don't plan on being just another soldier in their army." The tension in the city was like static electricity, you could feel it in the air, buzzing, waiting to spark. Every day brought fresh news, another body in a gutter, another ally switching sides. Bugsy thrived in it, he liked the action, the rush. Me? I liked the opportunities it created. One afternoon, Masuria called me into a back room at his club. The blinds were drawn, the air thick with cigar smoke. He poured me a drink and told me he wanted a certain warehouse burned down. Belonged to one of Maranzano's men. I nodded, took the job, and delivered. But the next night, I met with Maranzano in a quiet apartment above a bakery. He smiled like a man who already knew what I'd done. "You work for him," he said softly, "but I think you see the future better than he does." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. In that moment, he knew I wasn't married to either side. And that made me valuable. Weeks turned into months. The war dragged on, wearing the city thin. The police made a few token arrests, but mostly they stayed out of it. Too many of them were already on one payroll or the other. The press called it a gangland feud, but for those of us inside, it was more than that. It was a fight to decide the shape of organized crime in America for decades to come. The killings became more brutal. Masuria lost key men, gunned down in barber chairs, shot while walking to church. Maranzano's side took hits too, bombed cars, bodies turning up in the river. The body count climbed, and with each death, the balance of power shifted just enough to keep both sides from winning. I started thinking about how much money was being burned in this war. Every bullet, every bribe, every funeral, it was all eating into the profits. And for what? Pride? Old grudges from a country half a world away? That's when I started talking to both camps about a different kind of arrangement. Quietly. Carefully. Like planting seeds in dry soil. Why kill each other, I'd say, when we could run this city together? Make it a business, not a blood feud. Some listened. Most didn't. But I could tell the idea was sticking in a few minds. Then came the night I knew the tide was turning. I was meeting Meyer and Bugsy at a small restaurant when a kid burst in, out of breath, saying Maranzano had just lost 2 more men, good ones. That kind of loss doesn't just hurt, it rattles the walls of the whole operation. Meyer leaned in, his voice low. "If you're gonna make your move, it's gonna have to be soon." He was right. Masuria was getting sloppy, paranoid. He trusted fewer people, second-guessed every decision. Maranzano was patient, but his hunger for the top spot was showing. And me? I was in the middle, holding cards neither of them knew I had. The war had taken its toll on the streets. Business owners were scared to stay open late, families moved away if they could. But in the shadows, behind closed doors, something else was happening. The old way, the boss at the top, everyone beneath, was starting to crack. Men were talking about partnerships, about commissions, about ways to share the pie without killing each other over every slice. That was the future I saw. And if it meant making a choice between 2 kings to crown myself? Well, I'd been making choices like that my whole life. The war wasn't over yet, but the end was coming. You could feel it. The streets might not have known my name yet, but when they did, they'd know it as the man who turned the war into an empire. In this life, you don't just decide who to trust, you decide when to stop trusting him. The end of the Castellamarese War wasn't going to come with a handshake, it was going to come with a gunshot. And I knew exactly whose head that bullet was meant for. Joe the Boss Masuria had been my boss, my mentor in some ways, and the man who'd opened doors for me in the early days. But in our world, gratitude only goes so far. He was old school, too old school. He wanted the Sicilian way, where outsiders couldn't get a seat at the table and every decision had to pass through his stubborn grip. Problem was, the world was changing. I'd seen the future: multi-ethnic crews, national cooperation, a real commission to run things like a business. Masuria wasn't in that future. Maranzano knew it too. And in one of our quiet, almost polite meetings, he gave me the nod: it's time. It wasn't going to be easy. You don't just walk up to Joe Masuria and tell him his time is up. The man had eyes everywhere, and paranoia had made him even sharper. But paranoia also breeds patterns. And I knew one of his. Joe liked cards, poker specifically. He liked it in a small Coney Island restaurant where the air smelled of garlic and frying oil, and the owner knew to keep the back room stocked with cigars. He liked a small circle around him, just a few trusted men. And he liked me there, sitting across from him, smiling like nothing in the world was wrong. That was the setting. The play was simple: keep him comfortable until the right moment. Then the door opens, and the room changes forever. The day came gray and windy, the kind of afternoon where the sky feels heavy. I dressed carefully: dark suit, clean shave, no hat so there'd be nothing to hide my eyes. On the way, I stopped at a newsstand, bought a paper I didn't read, and slipped it under my arm. Little things to make it look like just another day. When I walked into the restaurant, the place was quiet. A couple of customers at the front, the clink of cutlery, the murmur of the radio. Joe was in the back already, with a drink in hand, cards fanned on the table. "Charlie," he said, grinning wide, the gold in his tooth catching the light. "Sit. We play a few hands, yes?" I smiled, took the seat across from him. Wouldn't miss it. The first hands were light, small bets, easy banter. He asked about business, about Meyer and Bugsy, about some minor shipments. I answered like always, calm, steady. Inside, every tick of the clock felt like a hammer. We ordered food: pasta, bread, a bottle of red. Joe poured for me, for himself. The air in that back room was warm, almost cozy. And maybe that's what made it feel so unreal when it happened. I heard the soft creak of the front door. Footsteps, muffled but purposeful. I kept my eyes on my cards, my ears on the rhythm of those steps. They paused just outside the back room, and then the door opened. 4 men stepped in: Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Bugsy Siegel, and Joe Adonis. All friends of mine. All here for the same reason. Joe's eyes flicked from me to them, confusion sharpening into realization. His hand went toward the table edge, maybe for a gun, maybe for something else. But the shots came before he could decide. The room exploded in sound, sharp cracks, the smell of gunpowder mixing with garlic and wine. Joe's chair tipped back, his body slumping sideways. The cards slipped from his hand and scattered on the floor, kings and queens face up against the wood. For a moment, the world went quiet again. No one said a word. The others left as quickly as they came, the door swinging shut behind them. I sat for another 30 seconds, my pulse finally slowing, the hum of the radio creeping back into my awareness. Then I stood, straightened my jacket, and stepped out into the front of the restaurant. The owner didn't need my eyes. He just wiped the same spot on the counter over and over, like if he kept moving his hands, nothing would stick to him. Outside, the wind had picked up, whipping the edges of my coat. I lit a cigarette, inhaled deep, and walked away. That night, word spread fast: Joe the boss is gone. By morning, every corner in the city knew. Some celebrated quietly. Some mourned. Most just adjusted their calculations. To the outside world, Maranzano had won the war. To me, it was just the first stage. Because I knew something Maranzano didn't: no one stays king forever. When I think back on it now, I don't feel guilt. I feel inevitability. In our world, loyalty isn't about never turning on someone, it's about knowing when turning on them serves the greater game. Joe had built his kingdom. I'd learned from it. And when the time came, I'd taken the pieces I needed to build my own. In the days that followed, I kept my head down, acted like just another soldier in Maranzano's army. He liked to think of himself as Caesar now, literally. He reorganized the families into legions, named captains, talked about honor and tradition. The older guys loved it. Me? I saw the same problem I'd seen with Masuria, too much old world thinking in a new world city. And in the back of my mind, the next move was already taking shape. Because in this business, a betrayal isn't just an ending, it's an opening. And I just stepped through one that could lead all the way to the top. We didn't just run the streets. We ran the country, only nobody called it that. With Masuria gone, the streets quieted, at least for a while. The Castellamarese War had ended with Salvatore Maranzano on the throne, calling himself the boss of bosses. The newspapers wrote about him like he was untouchable. The old Sicilians toasted him in backrooms. But I'd learned my lesson with Joe, no one's untouchable. Maranzano liked to talk about power like it was history class. He'd pace a room and compare himself to Julius Caesar, mapping out the legions of his criminal empire. In his mind, every family was a province, every underboss a governor. It sounded grand, but to me, it sounded like the past trying too hard to live in the present. I wanted something different. Something modern. The old ways kept the doors shut. If you weren't Sicilian, you'd never sit at the big table. But I'd spent my life making friends across lines that were supposed to be carved in stone. Meyer Lansky was Jewish. Bugsy Siegel was too. Frank Costello was Calabrian. Together, we'd made money and kept each other alive in the middle of a war. I wasn't about to tell them they couldn't sit next to me just because of where their parents were born. That's when the idea for the commission came to me. Not a single boss ruling over all the others, but a council of the most powerful men in the country. Disputes would be settled by vote, business would be run like a corporation, and everyone with real power would get a say. It was the only way to keep another street war from burning the whole thing down. But first, Maranzano had to go. He'd made it clear he didn't trust me. He respected me enough to keep me close, but he saw my friendships outside Sicilian circles as a threat. Word got back to me that he was planning to take me out, clean and quiet, just like we'd done to Joe. I decided not to wait for him to make his move. One September afternoon in 1931, I sent 4 men to his office, dressed as IRS agents. They walked in, asked a few questions, then pulled their guns. The boss of bosses died with a look of surprise, like he'd never imagined the history books wouldn't end with his chapter. And just like that, the throne was empty again. I didn't take it. Not officially. That was the beauty of the commission, no one man sat higher than the rest, at least not on paper. In practice, though, everyone knew who'd built it. We brought together bosses from New York, Chicago, Buffalo, Cleveland, Philadelphia. Italians, Jews, Irish, it didn't matter. The only qualification was that you had the power to move the game forward. Our meetings weren't about honor or blood feuds. They were about percentages, territories, supply lines. We talked shipping routes the way other businessmen talked railroads. We negotiated peace the way other businessmen negotiated contracts. It worked. Prohibition was still feeding the machine. Speakeasies in every major city poured money into our pockets. We ran the ports, the trucks, the warehouses. We had unions in our pockets, politicians on our payrolls, cops looking the other way. And because the commission kept everyone talking instead of shooting, we all made more money than we ever had before. I kept my public profile low. The papers loved a headline, and the last thing I needed was my face splashed across every front page. Frank Costello handled a lot of the politics, smoothing things over with City Hall. Meyer handled the numbers. Bugsy handled the people who didn't understand the new system. For me, the work was vision. Always looking 3 steps ahead. Figuring out where the money would be before anyone else saw it coming. Gambling was steady. Liquor was gold. But I knew the real future was in diversification, construction, trucking, even legitimate businesses we could use as fronts. It wasn't about looking respectable. It was about being untouchable. Sometimes at night, I'd think about the war we'd just survived. How many men had died for nothing more than pride? The commission wasn't just about making money, it was about making sure we never went back to that. At least, that's what I told myself. Truth was, it also kept me at the center of everything without having to take the heat that came with being the one and only boss. If a problem came up in Chicago, we all discussed it. If there was trouble in Buffalo, it wasn't Lucky's problem, it was the commission's problem. Shared responsibility meant shared protection. We held our first big meeting in a private room above a club. The table was long, the room thick with cigar smoke. Men leaned forward, voices low, deals being shaped in real time. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody reached for a gun. When it was over, I looked around that room and saw the future. No more single boss of bosses. No more street wars tearing apart the city. Just organized crime, emphasis on organized. From the outside, it probably looked like peace. From the inside, it felt like control. And for the first time, that control belonged to all of us. Or at least, that's what they believed. Funny thing about the top, you think it's the view that kills you. But it's the drop. By 1935, the city didn't just hum, it pulsed. And if you knew where to stand, you could feel that pulse under your shoes. Every shipment unloaded at the docks, every dice roll in a backroom, every whispered deal in a corner booth, it all ran through networks we'd built. The commission was more than an idea now, it was the nervous system of organized crime in America. And I was its heartbeat. On the surface, life was comfortable, the kind of comfortable you work your whole life for, even if it's the kind you can't exactly put in the bank. My suits were custom, lightweight wool from Italy in summer, heavier fabrics for winter. My shoes came from a cobbler who worked for politicians and movie stars. My nights were split between private clubs in Manhattan and quiet dinners in Brooklyn, always in rooms where the waiters knew my drink before I sat down. Frank Costello handled the political greasing, mayors, judges, anyone who could make a phone call and make a problem disappear. Meyer kept the books so tight you could balance them on a dime. Bugsy made sure the few who still thought about crossing us found better hobbies. It was a smooth operation, the kind that made you forget just how fragile it all was. Prohibition had ended, but that didn't slow us down, it just made us pivot. Gambling was steady. Narcotics were risky but profitable. Construction contracts, labor racketeering, loan sharking, they all fed into the same machine. We didn't own every block, but we owned enough of them that it felt like the city bent around us. People say crime doesn't pay. Maybe for amateurs. But when you run it like a business, when you keep the blood to a minimum and the cash flowing, it pays better than anything else in the world. I'd walk into a club and see the results all around me. Men laughing over champagne. Women in silk dresses leaning in close. Music from a jazz band floating above it all. And somewhere in that room, always, someone was there because I allowed it. There was a confidence to those years, the kind that made you feel like the rules didn't apply. Not in an arrogant way, at least not at first, but in a quiet certainty that you'd always find a way to win. That certainty made me careless, though I didn't see it then. You get too used to walking into any room and knowing you're the most important man in it. You get too used to hearing yes before you even finish your sentence. But cracks have a way of starting small. It began with whispers, prosecutors getting bolder, cops poking around places they used to leave alone. My name started to show up in the papers more often. Sometimes in bold headlines, sometimes buried in the back pages, but always there. Frank told me not to worry. They've been trying to get you for years, he said over a drink. They'll get bored and move on. Meyer didn't look so sure. The more visible we get, he told me quietly, the more they're gonna want a trophy. And you, Charlie, you're the biggest one they can grab. I shrugged it off. Maybe I shouldn't have. Still, in those moments, life felt untouchable. I'd sit in a leather chair in my suite at the Waldorf, phone in one hand, glass in the other, the city lights spilling through the window. Deals made with a few calls. Problems solved with fewer words. I liked to walk the streets late at night too, alone, except for a shadow trailing a few steps back. The city felt different at that hour. Quieter. Like it was mine in a way it never was during the day. Sometimes I'd pass a corner where I used to run errands as a kid and think about how far I'd come. From carrying packages for nickels to carrying the fate of the city in my pocket. From hustling in alleys to deciding who got to hustle at all. If there was a peak, I think that was it, those years when everything worked, when every player in the game knew their place, and I knew mine was at the center. But the thing about being at the center is it makes you easy to aim at. And somewhere out there, a man with ambition, or a badge, or both, was already lining up his shot. The drop was coming. I just couldn't see it yet. When the law comes knocking, you don't hear it at first until they kick the damn door down. It didn't happen overnight. That's the thing most guys don't understand about a takedown, there's no trumpet, no warning shot. It starts with whispers. A new name in the papers. Some assistant district attorney shaking hands in front of a camera. You don't pay attention at first. You should. The name was Thomas E. Dewey. Young, clean-cut, and with the kind of ambition that could light up the whole of Manhattan. Dewey had made his name going after bootleggers and racketeers. He was different from the cops we were used to. He didn't take envelopes. He didn't turn a blind eye. He wanted headlines. And I, unfortunately, was the headline he had in mind. It started small. Raids on brothels. A gambling den here, a numbers joint there. Normally, those were just the costs of doing business, close one place, open two more. But Dewey's raids were different. He didn't just grab the owners. He pulled in the girls, the gamblers, the street-level guys. And he didn't just book them, he got them to talk. It was methodical, like watching someone pull the threads from a suit until it's nothing but fabric on the floor. One afternoon, Frank Costello came into my office looking like he'd just walked through a cold wind. "They've got a dozen girls talking, Charlie," he said. "They're naming names." I didn't even look up from my drink. Girls talk. Always have. Frank shook his head. Not like this. Dewey's promising them protection, new lives. He's got 'em thinking they can walk away from all of it. The truth was, I'd never considered vice the core of my operation. Prostitution was steady money, sure, but compared to gambling or unions, it was small time. Still, Dewey knew what he was doing. He wasn't just going after the money, he was going after the narrative. He wanted the public to see me not as a businessman, not as a political operator, but as a pimp running a citywide flesh racket. And it worked. The newspapers ate it up. Luciano ring exposed, one headline blared. Another called me the Vice King of New York. Didn't matter that I wasn't running it day to day. In the court of public opinion, the truth mattered less than the picture they painted. Meyer told me to keep my distance from certain places, to tighten the circle. Bugsy thought we should send Dewey a message, something loud enough to make him think twice. I knew better. You can scare a beat cop. You can even scare a detective. But a man like Dewey? You scare him, and all you've done is hand him another headline. So I played it cool. I kept showing my face in the right clubs, shaking hands with the right people. I smiled for the cameras when I had to, like nothing in the world could touch me. But inside, I could feel the water level rising. The first real sign of trouble came when one of my closest lieutenants, Davy Batillo, got picked up. It wasn't just that they had him. It was that they had him on tape, talking. The technology was new, but it worked well enough to catch him saying things no jury would ignore. I had a choice: cut him loose, or try to pull him back into the fold. I chose loyalty. But loyalty can be dangerous when the man you're protecting is also the man holding a live grenade in his hands. The raids got bigger. Dewey was building a case, but he didn't rush it. He piled on charge after charge, letting the weight of it press down until it was impossible to shrug off. My lawyers kept telling me it was thin, that it was all circumstantial. But even I knew the jury wasn't gonna care about circumstantial when they were staring at a wall covered in photographs, witness statements, and seized ledgers. Frank started moving some of our money out of state, just in case. Meyer worked on cleaning up the books for anything they might try to tie directly to me. But deep down, I knew we were playing defense on a field Dewey had already chosen. The pressure wasn't just in the headlines. Politicians I'd been working with for years suddenly didn't return calls. Judges who used to nod my way in court halls now walked past like they didn't see me. The circle was closing, not with bullets, but with paper and ink. And still, I stayed calm. That's the thing they never understood about me. In a war, whether it's with guns or subpoenas, panic gets you killed. You keep your chin up, your voice even, your eyes steady. You don't let them smell fear. But I could feel it, like the faintest tremor before an earthquake. Dewey wasn't just aiming for a conviction. He was aiming for the conviction. The one that would make his career. The one that would be in history books. And I, lucky as I'd always been, was about to be his ticket there. I told myself I'd weather it. I'd been through worse. But the truth? I'd never faced a man who could take me down without ever pulling a trigger. They put me in a suit, sat me in front of 12 strangers, and told me my life was in their hands. The first day of the trial smelled like sweat, ink, and too much cologne. The courtroom was packed, reporters scribbling, photographers elbowing for a clean shot, curious locals leaning forward in their seats like they'd paid for the show. I walked in wearing my best dark suit, tie knotted just right, shoes polished to a mirror shine. If I was gonna be paraded like an exhibit, I'd make sure I looked like I owned the place. Dewey was there, of course. Crisp as ever, hair perfect, eyes sharp. He didn't look at me at first, not out of disrespect, but because he didn't need to. This was his stage, and he was the man everyone had come to see. I was just the main prop. The charges read out like a bad novel: compulsory prostitution, running a vast vice ring, conspiracy. The words vice king hung in the air, even though I didn't see myself that way. They wanted to paint me as a predator, a parasite. Me? I thought of myself as a businessman who happened to deal in things people wanted but couldn't get legally. My lawyer, George Morton Levy, leaned in before the jury came in. "We keep this clean," he whispered. "You don't lose your temper, you don't play into their hands." I gave him a half smile. "George, I'm the picture of charm." The prosecution opened with witnesses, women mostly. Some young, some worn down by the streets. They told their stories with practiced detail, describing how they'd been recruited, how they'd paid protection, how the network reached all over the city. Some cried. Some stared straight ahead, cold and steady. Every word chipped at the image I'd built. The jury leaned in. The reporters scribbled faster. I sat still, hands folded, eyes forward. Meyer came once, sitting in the back like any other spectator. He didn't nod, didn't wave. Just watched. He knew better than to get too close when the spotlight was this hot. Dewey's style was careful, deliberate. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. He built the case like a mason laying brick, each testimony another stone, each exhibit another layer. Ledgers, phone logs, photographs, every piece tying me to the machinery of the vice trade. Levy fought back where he could. He picked apart timelines, questioned credibility, pointed out contradictions. But I could see it in his eyes, the ground we were standing on was getting softer. On the third week, they brought out a ledger seized from a brothel. My name wasn't in it, not directly. But there were initials, notes, amounts. Enough for Dewey to weave a neat little story for the jury. This, Dewey said, holding it up like it was the crown jewels, is not a business ledger. It's a record of human lives being bought and sold for profit. And that profit leads to the man sitting right there. 12 pairs of eyes turned toward me. I didn't flinch. Inside, I thought about all the times I'd been in a room where my life depended on the people around me. Usually, I could read them, see who might fold, who might turn. But these jurors? They were a wall. The days blurred to testimony, cross-examinations, objections. The press outside the courthouse turned it into a circus. Headlines screamed my name. Cartoonists drew me with a crown and a whip. People I'd never met wrote letters calling for my head. At night, back in my cell, I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, replaying each day like a movie. Looking for the crack, the moment I could have tilted it in my favor. But every morning, the trial started fresh, and Dewey kept tightening the screws. Closing arguments came after 6 long weeks. Levy stood first. He talked about the presumption of innocence, about reasonable doubt. He reminded the jury there was no direct evidence, no photograph of me at a brothel, no recording of me giving orders. He painted me as a victim of ambition, Dewey's ambition. Then Dewey stood. And when he did, the air in the room seemed to sharpen. This case, he said, voice even, is about more than one man. It's about a system that thrives on exploitation, that corrupts our streets and our institutions. This man didn't just participate, he orchestrated it. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The conviction was in his tone, the weight of his words settling like a stone in the jurors' laps. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. I sat in the holding room, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, smoking one cigarette after another. Levy paced. Neither of us said much. When the guard finally came, I stubbed out my cigarette and straightened my tie. Guilty, the foreman said, his voice flat. On every count. A ripple went through the courtroom. Reporters dashed for the phones. Dewey didn't smile, not exactly, but there was a glint in his eyes. Levy put a hand on my shoulder. The judge gave me 30 to 50 years. It was more than a sentence, it was a message. They led me out in cuffs, cameras flashing. I kept my head high. If they were going to write about me, they'd write about a man who walked out like he still had cards to play. And maybe I did. You think prison's about the walls. It ain't. It's about the time and what it does to you. They sent me upstate Dannemora, the Siberia of New York. Cold in the winter, hot in the summer, and a kind of silence that didn't belong anywhere I'd ever been. The first thing you notice in prison isn't the bars or the guards. It's the smell of damp concrete, old sweat, and steel that's been touched by too many hands. The guards walked me in like I was just another body, but the other inmates, they knew who I was. Whispers followed me down the corridor. Some were curious, some resentful, a few respectful. In a place like that, your name buys you a little room to breathe. But not much. My cell was small, cold, and bare. A bed bolted to the wall, a thin mattress, a toilet, and nothing else. I sat on the bunk that first night, listening to the echo of doors clanging shut up and down the block. It wasn't fear I felt, not exactly. It was more like adjustment. The game had changed. The board was smaller. The pieces moved slower. But I'd been in tight spots before. Prison was just another kind of street, and streets had rules. You learn them fast, or you get swallowed. Days fell into a rhythm. Wake up to the clang of the bars. Breakfast in the mess hall, watery coffee, bread, sometimes oatmeal. Work detail. Yard time. Lights out. Time stretched in here, each day folding into the next until you forgot which was which. I read a lot. Newspapers mostly. Kept tabs on the outside, on the names that were still moving pieces in the game I'd helped build. Some of those names got bigger. Some disappeared entirely. Meyer visited once in a while. He'd sit across the table in the visitors' room, his voice low, telling me how the commission was holding together. Frank Costello came too, more often, usually with the kind of news that was half business, half comfort. "You'll be out before you know it," Frank would say. I knew better. But it was good to hear. In the yard, I kept to myself at first. There were crews in here, same as on the outside: Italians, Irish, Black, Puerto Rican. The same invisible borders, just smaller. Eventually, I made friends where it made sense, stayed neutral where it didn't. I didn't need to run anything in here. My empire was still out there, moving without me. But time worked on you. The sharp edges softened. You start to measure your days in letters received, in the rare meals that break the monotony, in the moments when the sunlight hits your face and you almost forget there's a fence around you. Then came the war. December 1941, Pearl Harbor. America was in it now, and everything changed overnight. Factories went to war production, men enlisted, and the government started looking at every angle, every connection, every way to secure the home front. That's when they came to me. Not directly, of course. But word got through: the Navy needed help. German U-boats were sinking ships right off the American coast. There were whispers of spies in the docks, sabotage in the ports. And the Navy didn't have full control over those ports. Not without certain cooperation. Cooperation I could provide. It was a strange thing, making a deal with the same government that had put me behind bars. But the terms were simple: I'd help secure the docks in New York and along the East Coast using my connections with the longshoremen, the unions, and the crews who actually moved the cargo. In exchange, they'd consider leniency. So I said yes. From my cell, I passed word. Contacts met in backrooms, in quiet corners of bars, in union offices that smelled of sawdust and cigars. Orders moved down the chain: watch the docks, keep the cargo safe, report anything suspicious. And it worked. The sabotage stopped. The Navy got their secure ports. And my name, for the first time in a long time, was being spoken in government offices without a curse attached to it. By 1946, the deal had played its course. My lawyers pushed for release, arguing that my cooperation had been critical to the war effort. Dewey himself, now Governor Dewey, signed off on it. But there was a catch. I wasn't going home. Part of the agreement was exile. Back to Italy. Back to the place I'd left as a kid. The day they released me, the air felt different. Softer. Warmer. Even the sun looked sharper. But I knew I wasn't walking back into the New York I'd built. That city was gone to me now. They put me on a ship. No fanfare, no crowd. Just a quiet departure for a man who'd once ruled a kingdom he could no longer touch. Naples was beautiful. The kind of beautiful that makes you forget for a moment why you're there. The bay, the narrow streets, the sound of church bells in the distance. But it wasn't mine. The language was familiar, the faces too, but the rhythm of the place didn't match the one I'd learned to live by. In the cafes, I'd hear talk of America, new deals, new bosses, the way things were moving without me. And I'd sit there, sipping my espresso, wondering if they still thought of me when they made the big moves. I didn't try to go back. Not officially. The agreement was clear, and besides, I knew the city had changed. New kings were sitting in the chairs I'd once pulled out for myself. That's the thing about power: it doesn't just vanish. It moves. In exile, I had time to think. About the choices I'd made. About the men I'd trusted. About the deals that had gone right, and the ones that had gone wrong. Prison had slowed me down. Italy stopped me entirely. But even then, part of me was still watching the board. Still calculating. still thinking about the next move even if I'd never get to make it. The streets in Naples were nothing like New York, but I still knew how to walk. Naples had a rhythm of its own. The mornings started slow, the air carrying the smell of coffee and fresh bread, church bells breaking the quiet like a reminder that life kept moving whether you wanted it to or not. I'd walk the narrow streets with my hands in my pockets, nodding to the shopkeepers, stopping for a newspaper I barely read. It wasn't New York. There were no skyscrapers, no steam rising from manhole covers, no traffic lights blinking over an endless tide of cars. But a street is a street, and a man who knows how to move through one never forgets. I kept my pace measured, my eyes open, and my back to the wall when I stood still. Old habits even in a place where the danger wasn't the same. Word traveled fast in Naples. Some knew exactly who I was. Others only knew I was an American Italian with nice suits and a certain way of speaking. The ones who did know often tried to pull me into their business, small-time rackets, petty disputes. I always shook my head. I'm retired, I'd say, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. My days settled into a routine. Morning coffee at the same cafe. A walk by the waterfront, where the sun bounced off the bay in a way that made you forget every mistake you'd ever made. Lunch with an old friend, sometimes a local, sometimes an associate visiting from abroad. Afternoons spent reading history, mostly. I'd always liked the stories of empires. You could learn a lot about the rise and fall of power from men who'd worn crowns instead of fedoras. Evenings were quiet. A small apartment overlooking the city, a bottle of wine, the sound of Vespas echoing up from the street. Sometimes I'd play cards with a few neighbors, keeping the stakes low. Other times I'd sit by the window and watch the lights come on, one by one, across the city. New York felt far away, but it was never gone. Visitors would bring me news: who was running which family now, who had been taken out, which rackets were booming. Sometimes I'd hear about someone I'd once put on the path to power. Sometimes about someone I'd crossed. Either way, I'd listen without comment, just a quiet nod or a slight smile. I never asked for details. The details didn't matter anymore. Still, every now and then, a part of me itched to be back in the game. Not for the money, I'd had money. Not for the danger, I'd had that too. It was for the rhythm, the endless moves, the negotiations, the sense that you were shaping something bigger than yourself. Naples was peaceful, but peace can feel like standing still. One afternoon, I was sitting at my usual cafe when a young man approached. Sharp suit, slick hair, confidence in his stride. He introduced himself as the nephew of an old associate. "My uncle says you're the man who knew how to run a city," he said, leaning in. "He says you could teach me a thing or two." I sipped my espresso, watching him over the rim of the cup. "I could," I said. "But the first thing I teach you is to get out before you ever think you're in." He didn't understand, not really. You never do until you've lived it. The years went by. My hair went silver, my steps slowed, but I never lost the habit of looking over my shoulder. Not out of fear, just instinct. Once you've walked the streets as a player, you don't stop reading them, even when you're just passing through. By the late 1950s, my health wasn't what it used to be. The doctors told me to take it easy, to cut back on the cigars and the wine. I told them I'd consider it. We all have our vices, and mine had been with me longer than most friends. I knew I was winding down. Not in a dramatic way, just the quiet understanding that every man's clock runs out sooner or later. And when mine did, I wanted it to be in a chair with the sun on my face, not in some backroom with a gun in my ribs. Looking back, Naples was the kind of place a man like me could only end up in, far from the city I'd helped shape, yet still surrounded by streets, by people, by the hum of life moving on. It wasn't where I thought I'd finish. But maybe it was where I was meant to. People remember the money, the power, the crimes, but me? I remember the nights. It was a cold January afternoon in 1962 when the clock finally caught up with me. Naples was gray that day, the kind of gray that sits heavy on the sea and makes the air taste like salt and rain. I had a meeting scheduled, nothing serious, just business talk with an old contact from America. We were supposed to meet at the airport, grab a coffee, maybe discuss something that could have put me back in the game in a small way. I never made it past the lobby. They said it was a heart attack. One moment I was walking, the next I was on the floor, my hat rolling away like it was trying to escape the scene. A few people rushed over, voices blurred in Italian, footsteps echoing on the tile. And just like that, it was over. No bullets. No backroom deal gone wrong. No betrayal in the dark. Just the final, quiet collapse of a man whose life had been anything but quiet. Word traveled fast. Even in exile, even decades removed from the streets of New York, my name still had weight. Newspapers in America ran headlines. Some called me the last emperor of the underworld. Others went with former Vice King dies in Naples. Funny thing about a man's life, you don't get to choose the headline they give you. My funeral was small but not empty. A handful of locals, a few old friends who made the trip from America, some faces from the shadows who preferred to stay at the edge of the crowd. No brass bands, no limousines lined up outside. Just a wooden box, a priest speaking words about a soul he'd never met, and the smell of damp earth. Some of the old-timers whispered about the deals I'd made, the bosses I'd put in their seats, the empire I'd shaped. The younger ones, the ones running the streets now, just nodded politely. To them, I was a name in the history books, a legend told in stories after too many drinks. I've thought about legacy a lot. People remember the big moments, the hits, the wars, the headlines. They remember the betrayals, the alliances, the money. But those aren't the things I carry with me, even now, in whatever place a man ends up after his last breath. I remember the nights. The fog on the docks as a shipment rolled in. The low hum of conversation in a backroom where a deal was about to be made. The sound of a city holding its breath before a move that would change everything. The moments when the streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, and I felt, for just a heartbeat, that the city belonged to me. History will judge me however it wants. Some will call me a criminal. Some will call me a visionary. Both are true, in their way. I took a world that was chaotic, violent, and bound by old grudges, and I turned it into something organized. Something that could last. But organization doesn't stop the clock. It doesn't stop the next man from coming along, building something new on top of what you made, and calling it his own. That's the way it's always been. That's the way it will always be. In the end, maybe legacy isn't about the buildings that carry your name, or the bank accounts you leave behind, or the statues, not that they ever made one of me. Maybe it's about the stories people tell when your name comes up. The way their voice changes just a little. The way they lean in, even if they weren't there, just to hear about the time Lucky Luciano did this or that. Somewhere in New York, long after I was gone, I imagine the city still moving to a rhythm I helped set. The commission still meeting in some quiet room. Deals still being made in the same way, with the same nods and handshakes I'd perfected. And maybe, just maybe, some kid running errands for a couple of older guys is hearing my name for the first time and thinking, yeah, I could be that. If that's my legacy, it's enough. I didn't die in the streets. I didn't die in prison. I didn't die at the hands of some rival with a grudge. I died standing, a little older, a little slower, but still wearing my suit, still moving through the world on my own terms. And for a man like me, that's about as close to winning as you can get. That's the story. My rise, my fall, my time in between. The city gave me everything and took it back piece by piece, like it always does. But I can't say I'd change much. Every move I made, every man I shook hands with or double-crossed, every deal, every night, it all led here. And if I had to do it over again, knowing exactly where I'd end up? Yeah. I'd still take the ride. That's the end of Fall Asleep to the Rise and Fall of Lucky Luciano. It starts with a city holding its breath and ends with the man who once made it exhale quietly taking his last.